Book titles are a very strange thing, and they have admittedly changed considerably over the years. In a recent editorial on the Reddit webpage, they commented on the old tradition of the 18th and 19th century for longer and more descriptive titles. They note, for instance, that the adventure novel Robinson Crusoe was first published on the following 65-word title. I think I've got a picture for you of the cover page there. This was the original title of Robinson Crusoe. It was called The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner, who lived 8 and 20 years all alone in an uninhabited island on the coast of America near the mouth of the great river Orinoco, having been cast on shore by shipwreck, wherein all the men perished but himself, with an account of how he was at last strangely delivered by pirates. I'm not sure that a book would survive today with a title that long. It's interesting that in a strange twist of history repeating itself, websites are now playing around with their titles and headings. And to get your website noticed today, you need to include as many popular keywords and phrases as possible so that they can hook you when you search for your favorite key terms. So apparently websites now are going to longer and longer titles to include as many keywords as possible to drag you in. But books are still a little different. I suppose it says something about the increasingly competitive world of book publishing that during my many years in the industry, I think I spent more time in committee meetings trying to figure out what we were going to put on the cover of a book and what the title was going to be than we did worrying about the content. We figured the content was secondary. As long as the book has a good title and a good picture on the cover, we can sell it. The challenge these days is to come up with a title that's catchy and attractive while expressing the content of the book as succinctly as possible. When it comes to the books of the Old Testament, for directness and description of the content, it's hard to beat a little book of the Old Testament called Lamentations. It's pretty clear what you're in for when you pick up a book with that as a title. Unfortunately, it's not really a catchy title, I think. If you have your Bible nearby, I'm going to invite you to reach for it and turn to the little book of Lamentations. The English names of many of the books of the Old Testament draw their titles from the old Hebrew tradition of using the first word of the book. It's the case with the book of Genesis, for example. In the beginning is that Hebrew word, and to the Greek at the beginning we get our word Genesis. Our title for Lamentations comes from an inscription that was at the top of the book in the Greek Septuagint. That was the translation of the Hebrew Bible put into Greek. It's pretty clear that the 5 poems in this little collection were written as a reflection on the fall of Judah and its capital city in 586 BC. The Babylonians come in and they just decimate the place, and these 5 poems are written in reflection of that. Over a century before, in 722 BC, the northern portion of Israel had been attacked and taken away into captivity after many repeated warnings by the prophet. And that really scared the people in the southern kingdom of Judah. They saw their brothers and sisters to the north get deported. It kind of scared them. They tried a little harder for a while, but ultimately they strayed from God. Badly enough, in fact, that the prophet started again and said, look, if you don't straighten up and fly right, the same thing is going to happen to you as happened to the kingdom in the north. And the prophet Jeremiah is one of the last prophets to serve in this ministry. It's detailed in the book by his name. And the book details God's final attempt to recall the people back. I'm warning you one last time. Come on, one last time. This is your last chance before tragedy happens. But eventually, tragedy occurs. The Babylonians attack. The little collection of poetry in the book of Lamentations is technically anonymous. But the timing of the writing, the content of the poems, and a lot of the language fits so well with the writings of the prophet Jeremiah. He was in fact so solidly identified as the author by the wide consensus of Jewish tradition that when the Hebrew Bible was translated into the Greek for the Septuagint, the book was prefaced with this additional explanation. And it came to pass after Israel was led into captivity and Jerusalem was laid waste, that Jeremiah sat weeping and lamented with this lamentation over Jerusalem and said, and it's from that inscription we get our English title of the book of Lamentations. The Latin Vulgate thought they needed to qualify that a little more. They added a little phrase to the title. Jeremiah sat weeping and lamenting with these words, with a bitter spirit, sighing and wailing. Let there be no doubt then what the book of Lamentations is about. They're sighing and wailing and crying and gnashing of teeth. I confess that I faced a challenge when I debated about the title for the series we're starting tonight. I wasn't sure that just telling you we were going to read through the book of Lamentations together would draw a big crowd. But in these difficult days, I felt our hearts really needed what this little book has to say. I try to be reading and preparing several months ahead for these series. And over the last year or two, my struggle was really with the theological uncertainty and the challenges that our church is facing. Considering the congregations that are closing down, that are losing their buildings, that are longing for better days gone by, the churches that are struggling just to keep their doors open, I'd been reflecting on the possibility of looking at Lamentations because in many ways it's not just the expression of individual grief, it really respects the grieving of a wider community. And I thought it reflected the lament within our Presbyterian church. A man that I consider a good friend this past October, Canadian Presbyterian pastor Reverend Donald MacLeod, published his reflection on 50 years of ministry within the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And appropriately, he called the book a Presbyterian Requiem. You know what a requiem is? It's the dirge sung at a funeral. So I'd been digging into Lamentations already. And then when the pandemic hit, I started getting serious about the book, and I found a real solace in it. As the pain and the struggle of the pandemic have been made worse by the isolation and the curfew and the distance of the increased restrictions we're facing, particularly here in Quebec, the words of the book have really become powerfully prophetic for me. In his introduction to the book of Lamentations, one of the commentators makes this interesting observation. He says, we've come a long way from our straight-laced Victorian roots. In our day, we talk about sex openly and casually in public with euphemism and cute expressions and straight-out comments that would have made most of our grandmothers blush in embarrassment. But when it comes to grief and tragedy and death, we simply don't have the vocabulary. We don't have a way to express that pain. We don't talk about that loss. In the rush of our everyday lives, we don't dwell on grief and loss any more than we have to. The appropriate response to pain is always to reach for the bottle of aspirin. As we compare the turmoil of our lives to the wonderful fairy tale experience our friends display on their social media pages, we quickly understand that we're not to dwell on our own difficult circumstances, and we're especially not to make them the subject of polite discussion when we're in public. Over these last 8 or 9 years since my arrival at Cote de Neiges, the Lord has used the unusual circumstances of geography and presence to lead into an important ministry of accompanying families through the process of grief and loss. Over these last 8 or 9 years, I've now officiated almost 600 funerals since my arrival. Though they're increasingly no longer called funerals. We call them celebrations of life. We call them life histories. And often for financial reasons that I understand, people are increasingly opting for cremation. So we get to the funeral, it's not a funeral, it's a celebration of life, and there's no body, there's no casket. There's just this neat little sanitized box with a nice picture next to it. It's a little more soothing maybe, but it really doesn't force us to confront our grief. And I understand, I know the need to respond to the grief with words of hope, and I know there's financial issues involved, and we want to give thanks for lives well lived. But the human heart really needs those moments when we stop and take note that something has changed. Something has been lost. Something is broken, and something won't be the same ever again. And so as I work with the families to plan the event that will be helpful and meaningful, part of my role is often to slow the process down, to be sure they realize that as positive as we want to be on the day of the celebration of life, there's a page that's been turned. And when that grief is not expressed in public at the celebration, I always engage in ways that allow the family and the close friends to speak their loss, to express their grief, to state what has happened. It's vital for them, for their emotional health, for the transition, to be able to carry on with closure, that the loss is expressed, that it's spoken out loud, that it's heard. In Shakespeare's play Macbeth, Macduff loses somebody close to him, and he's given this advice: give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the o'erfraught heart and bids it break. When we don't give our sorrow words, the grief boils and breaks our heart. Kubler-Ross and Kessler in their seminal works on mourning and grief repeatedly underline the need to express the loss in tears and in words. There's an old Yiddish expression that says that tears are the soap of the soul. Tears are the soap of the soul. I want to confess to you that for many years, when I first started to preach, I really didn't like the book of Lamentations. I didn't go there often. There were one or two really positive verses in the middle of chapter 3, and I used to go there all the time. And my feeling every time I read that Lamentations, I thought, Jeremiah, okay, take a minute, go off in your room, shut the door, cry it out, work it out, and then come back to polite public conversation when you're ready to carry on. You know, you're grieving, you're fine. Just deal with it, and when you're ready to just come back and join the rest of us. And then it happened to me. I began to encounter grief and loss. I lost my father to cancer painfully. First, there was mourning for others at a safe distance, and then the hard-hitting, brutal reality of losing somebody I had loved, and then somebody else, and then somebody else, and then losing a job I liked, and then losing a position I had enjoyed. I think that many of you who've struggled with deep grief and anxiety, with loss and tragedy, you often get that feeling that lamentations are not welcome. Lamentations is not something we do in private company. When you're having a hard time, people just want you to go off somewhere alone, work your stuff out behind closed door, and then when you're ready to start crying and weeping and blubbering, then you can come back and join public company. I grew up in a tradition that really valued strong marriages and close-knit homes, and this is great. It's important. Except that at those times when things don't work out and your marriage starts falling apart, you feel really like you're an unwanted pariah. And time again, I watched as individuals struggling through divorce, what some have labeled as a pain worse than the death of a spouse, had to leave the church just to find safety. They had to go and deal with it alone, weep, cry, be broken, and then try and come back a little bit later. And ironically, because the church wants to be careful not to condone divorce, we're not there to provide solace and comfort in the most painful experience in most people's lives. And how often the church does that with other pain. I can't tell you how many years it was for Debbie and I as we struggled through one miscarriage after another, how many years it took before I was actually able to comfortably on a Sunday morning say the word miscarriage in church. You somehow get the feeling that when you're struggled with grief, you need to leave polite company, have your time out alone in the corner, and then come back when you're over it. But the book of Lamentations flies in the face of all of that. Because whatever your struggle and your pain, you need to take comfort just from the fact that the book of Lamentations is here. And the book of Lamentations is not a personal, private lament like some of the Psalms are. It is a community lament. It is written for people who are grieving and weeping and crying together over a tragedy. Its presence, the presence of the book of Lamentations in the canon of Scripture says that there is a place to express grief, to name it, to weep over it, to struggle with the uneasy link between guilt and grief, even to cry out to God and ask the hard questions, why and how long? To your comfort, certainly to mine, the texts we're going to read together in the book of Lamentations are not neatly packaged little liturgical prayers with easy answers and clear responses from God. In fact, the actual praying doesn't really start until the 5th chapter, after there's been a lot of crying and hand-wringing recriminations. And I think that in many ways, Lamentations is a little closer to my experience with pain than the book of Job. I want to give you a spoiler alert here if you've never read Lamentations. Unlike what happens at the end of the book of Job, God never shows up at the end of Lamentations to answer everybody's questions and to restore Job all that he'd lost. In fact, in Lamentations, God never speaks. Doesn't even show up. Leslie Allen titled his commentary in the book of Lamentations, The Liturgy of Grief, and I like the way he describes the book of Lamentations with 3 words. He says Lamentations is about 3 things: tears, talk, and time. You weep, you talk about it, and you wait. Over these next number of weeks together on Sunday evenings, We're to continue to wrestle with the difficult reality of these days, of the pandemic, of the future of our church, of the private griefs and struggles that many of you are carrying. We want the words of this book to lead us to a place where we can express our mourning, even feel safe to weep and come before God and to wait in his presence. Tears, talk, and time. Let's ask God to open our hearts to his word. Loving Father, we are in the midst of our pain, and we've learned from hard experience that sometimes it just feels better to be left alone. Teach us again tonight in your word that it is precisely at these moments that we need to come to you, to one another, and to pour our hearts out. Touch our hearts tonight. Hear our pain, we ask. In Christ's name, amen. I need to give you just two quick pointers before we read some of the text together. In our English Bibles, the book of Lamentations is placed among the prophetic books right after Jeremiah because of what we believe to be the link of authorship. So it's tucked in there. There's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and the others. But in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's part of the Megillot. The Megillot is a collection of 5 short scrolls that are read on various festivals of the Jewish religious year. It's grouped there with 4 other books: Ruth, the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And each one of those is read on another feast of the Jewish year. Lamentations is read on the 9th day of the month of Av, and that feast day commemorates 2 things. The destruction of 2 temples, actually. The destruction of the temple in 586 BC during the time of Jeremiah, the one we're in now in Lamentations, and then later Solomon's temple that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So what we're going to read together is pure poetry. Unlike the book of Job that has all this prose and story at the beginning and at the end, and the book of Esther and Ruth that has all this prose, this book is pure poetry. And it probably appears to be laid out as some kind of liturgy, probably meant to be read in a group setting. And this is the way it's used now on the 9th day of Av, still by Jewish communities in their liturgy. Now the book of Daniel talks about what's happening to God's people who got taken away into captivity. Daniel and his friends have left Israel. They're in Babylon. They're in the big city with all the civilization around them. Lamentations is not about those people. Lamentations is about the people who didn't get deported, the people who were left behind in Jerusalem. The big foreign army has attacked, they've besieged the city, they've burnt it to the ground, they've destroyed the temple, they've taken everything of value, they've taken away anybody who's important, and what's left literally is the dregs. It's the poor people, the impoverished people, the weak, the old, the handicapped, and they have very little left. I found myself thinking as I prepared that maybe the book would be read with a little bit more interest. Instead of being called Lamentations, it had been called Left Behind. I wonder whether the book would get more attention if it had been called Left Behind instead of Lamentations, but there it is. These are the people who get left behind after all the important people and stuff gets taken away to Babylon. So we're reading Hebrew liturgical poetry. It's a group lament, and it typically doesn't rhyme at the ends of the lines like we do in English, but it does play with other features. 3 or 4 things to look out for as we go. The first 4 chapters are written in acrostics, A, B, C, D, E, all the way through. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. It works its way through the successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 3 really goes a little wild. It does a triple acrostics. We'll see that when we get to chapter 3 together. Chapter 5 doesn't follow the letters of the alphabet, but it's got 22 verses. We'll talk about this again as we work our way through. There's a reason why it's done this way, and it's important. Now, each of the individual verses are little sets of 3 couplets. Hebrew depends very much on something we call parallelism. They write poetry in 2 lines, and usually the lines play together. So in the book of Proverbs, there are 6 things the Lord can't stand, 7 things that he hates. So there's 2 little bits of lines that kind of play off against each other. And sometimes the second line adds new information, sometimes it bounces off the first. But the writer does something peculiar with the couplets. Usually when parallelism is used, both lines are equal length, just about. But as you'll see when we read through, the second line is always shorter. And it sort of has this beat rhythm thing. It always feels like you're being cut off. It feels like the thought never gets finished. It feels like you're praying to God and you never quite get the words out. You express your pain and then you run out of words. You can't quite figure out how to express this to God. So let's read some poetry together. Lamentations 1. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. The poem begins with this guttural cry. The how at the beginning of verse 1 actually isn't part of the couplet, we think. It's the Hebrew word is eka. One of the words I like when I'm playing Scrabble is the word arg, because you can get a couple G's and H's in there. You know that guttural expression when you hit your thumb with a hammer and you don't want to come out with a bad word and you're like, fiddlestick, whatever you say. That opening word is literally this. It's like, oh, lonely lies the city. When I designed the little leaflet to announce the beginning of the new series, I was looking for a nice black and white picture of the streets of Montreal with nobody in them for the curfew. I found one that worked okay. You can kind of see the Beausecour Market in the back. But to find that picture, I had to sort through a great number of pictures, and I got a lot of pictures about some of the great cities of the world, what they look like now that they're totally abandoned under the COVID restrictions. I'm not sure if you've ever been to Times Square in New York City. Talk about a place that's always hopping in the middle of a city that never sleeps. I got to New York City a couple times, and I got there once for a conference, and we had panels and workshops all day. The last workshop ended at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and after the conference wind down, there was coffee and donuts and stuff. It was about midnight, and I was making my way back to the hotel, and I realized that I was within walking distance of Times Square, and I thought this would be a great time to go see Times Square. There shouldn't be nobody. I'll get it to myself. Yeah, right. I got to Times Square at 12:30 at night, and you could barely stand. It was so crowded with people. Not today. You've seen pictures of downtown New York City in the middle of the COVID pandemic in isolation. It's this eerie feeling. And so as Lamentations begin, right away the scene is set with an empty city of Jerusalem. The writer wants you to get this image. Wants to grab your attention by having you imagine what happened. It's not just an empty city. This is the hub city. This was a center of trade. This was a center of commerce. For the Jews, this was a center of faith, of devotion, of life, of worship, of coming to the temple. But the streets are empty. There used to be people, but they're all gone. And then slowly he begins to draw an image for you. This isn't just a city. The city becomes a person. The city is a woman. She's a woman in distress. And it's not that she's unmarried. It's not just that she's in distress because she's a single woman looking for a husband. When you're single and unmarried, at least there's a sense of hope that one day the city is a widow, with all that that word implies. We've lost the strength and the power of that word today. It's bad enough when we hear the word widow in our day, we think of the sense of loss, this woman who had something with someone that she'd lost. But in that day, being a widow brought an additional sense of hopelessness and helplessness. To be widowed in the wrong circumstance would condemn you to poverty and struggle the whole rest of your life. And it's not just that she's lost a husband, she's lost a great stature that she once had. She was married, she had a husband, she had stature, she was a princess, she was married to a king, she was in the palace, and all of that is gone. She'd been a great city, a princess among the nations, but not anymore. She's a slave now. Verse 2, she weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she's none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. The word lovers here isn't not just about promiscuity. That's not the point. There was a moment when the city had been respected and loved, not just by her husband, but by the community. All of the little towns around, they looked at Jerusalem as a place of hope. And during the time of peace and prosperity, Jerusalem had made pacts and agreements with surrounding nations, with other cities. There were commercial treaties and agreements of mutual aid that were supposed to kick in times of distress. But when the Babylonians finally attacked, all of her allies, all of her friends, not only did they not come to help as they were supposed to, they turned on her. Some years before the city of Jerusalem, the whole tribe of Judah fell to the Babylonians. They had been subdued first. The Babylonians had come in. They hadn't destroyed anything. They just subdued them, and they were paying taxes. They were paying a levy. In the whole surrounding area, all the cities, they're all vassal states to the Babylonians. They kept working as if everything was okay, but they paid this tax, this levy to the Babylonians. And King Zechariah thought, that's it. We're not paying the tax anymore. We're not sending our money to Babylon anymore. And Babylon responded with force. And as the Babylonians were coming to attack because Judah has refused to pay the levy, they sent distress call to all their friends and said, come and help us. The Babylonians are going to attack. Come and join us. We'll revolt against the Babylonians together and we'll win. And the neighbors didn't help. Not only that, but when the Babylonians came and they broke through the siege, they broke through the city walls, the neighboring countries actually swarmed in to take part in the plunder and to steal what the Babylonians hadn't stolen from Jerusalem. And then the refugees from the broken city of Jerusalem, when the walls broke, we read in the history books that some of the people from Jerusalem fled to the surrounding countries and asked for refuge. And instead of being given refuge, the former neighbors and friends captured them and brought them back to the Babylonians to be taken into captivity. These next few verses, remember what that was like when the Babylonians broke through the city walls and the people went running for cover not to be taken captive. Verse 3, Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and hard servitude. She dwells now among the nations, but finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for none come to the festival. All her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her virgins have been afflicted, and she herself suffers bitterly. There's this play on word as we make the transition between verse 3 and verse 4. The last statement in verse 3 talks about being overtaken in distress. The Hebrew expression for distress is the word that refers to a narrow pass. When you're in distress, you're in this narrow mountain pass and you can barely make it through. You're pushed on both sides. There's a cliff on one side and a rock. It's kind of like the equivalent of being between a rock and a hard place in Hebrew. And so, as the people fled, the inhabitants tried to sneak away. They knew the secret passes and the hidden path to escape from the city through the woods and the surrounding hills and mountains. They thought they'd be safe, but the enemy came to find them there. And while there's all this activity in the narrow hidden mountain passes where there's no escape, the big, wide, open main road that leads to the city gate, to the center of the city, to the marketplace and the temple, the main street, it's empty now. And the priests are waiting at the temple at the end of the highway leading into Jerusalem. It takes you to the front steps of the temple leading up to the Temple Mount. The priests are waiting there for the worshipers to come, but nobody's coming. The streets are empty. Nobody's coming to church today. The Decarie is empty. Nobody's driving on the Metropolitan. And the pain gets more intense now as the city not only has lost her position of prestige and the security of her husband, now her children have been taken away. Verse 5. Her foes have become the head, her enemies prosper because the Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away, captives before the foe. As was the case with any invading force, there's a couple things the Babylonians really wanted, and one of those was slave labor. So when you move in, you swoop in, you overtake a city, anybody who's strong and capable, anybody who looks like they could do a good day's work, any of the children who had the potential to be good house servants, they were all taken away as booty, captives, slaves. Imagine the pain of the parents who were left behind in the broken down, burned out city of Jerusalem, having no idea what would become of the children they saw taken away in chains by the invading Babylonians. But even the great and powerful leaders of the city had been unable to defend the people from their calamity. When the walls were breached, they ran like hunted deer. This talks about Zechariah, the king, and the nobles. From the daughter of Zion, all her majesty had departed. The king has run away like a coward. Her princes have become like deer that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuers. After the breaching of the walls, King Zechariah had pre-planned an escape attempt with some of his nobles and his personal guard. You know the way if the White House is ever breached, apparently, there's guys that jump on the president, bring him down to a bunker, and that's all set with the Secret Service. Well, King Zechariah had worked all that out. They were waiting for the Babylonians to break through the walls, and he told his guys, when they break through, if they make it through, okay, here's what we're going to go through. We're going to go through the tunnel. You're going to help me, and it didn't work out. King Zechariah wound up trapped like a hunted deer, powerless. The walls were breached. The king was taken. The children were brought into captivity. And then the looting began. The first 6 verses talk about what happened to the people. The next verses talk about what happened to the materials, the pillaging, the personal property, the commercial goods and the valuable things in the temple. They get taken away. We learn from the book of Daniel the Babylonians had made a point of collecting all the sacred vessels and instruments from the temple and bringing them to the temples of their own gods, using them in idolatry and immorality. And with the loss of personal property comes the shame and embarrassment of being unclothed and dishonored. And then with no money, no resources left, you begin to run out of food. Verse 7, Jerusalem remembers in the days of her affliction and wandering all the precious things that were hers from days of old. When her people fell into the hand of the foe and there was none to help her, her foes gloated over her. They mocked at her downfall. Jerusalem sinned grievously, therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despised her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Therefore the fall is terrible. She has no comforter. O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. The enemy has stretched out his hands over all her precious things, for she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, those whom you forbade to enter your congregation. All her people groan as they search for food. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Now, something interesting happens in the text. There's a shift, and it happens slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. From the beginning of the text in verse 1, it's a narrator who's been speaking, and he's describing the scene. And he's begun to describe the city as a woman. She's widowed now. She's deprived of her children. She's impoverished, humiliated, no clothes, nothing to eat. And over these few verses, we've slowly begun to imagine this woman in pain. And now several descriptive verses in, we can almost picture this poor woman, and she actually begins to speak. It's not the narrator anymore, it's Jerusalem, this woman who speaks. She slipped in a few words at the end of verse 9, O Lord, behold my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. But now halfway through verse 11, she takes over and she begins to speak. And as she describes her trouble in her own words, she wants to talk about who's to blame for all the pain and all the turmoil and all the upheaval. Why is this happening? Whose fault is this? The end of verse 11, look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire into my bones, and he made it descend. He spread a net for my feet. He turned me back. He has left me stunned, faint all the day long. This is God who's done this. But has he done this on a whim? Did God just inflict this pain for the pleasure of inflicting pain? This woman begins to explain what's happened to her in why in verse 14. The city speaks, my transgressions were bound into a yoke. By his hand they were fastened together. They were set upon my neck. He caused my strength to fail. The Lord gave me into the hands of those whom I cannot withstand. The Lord rejected all my mighty men in my midst. He summoned an assembly against me to crush my young men. The Lord has trodden as in a winepress the virgin daughter of Judah. For these things I weep, my eyes flow with tears, for a comforter is far from me, one to revive my spirit. My children are desolate, for the enemy has prevailed. Now this is a peculiar piece of text. Scholars have a hard time assigning it to a specific genre. In the Psalms, we find some psalms of lament. There are a lot of them. David writes a whole bunch of them. In the Psalms of Lament, the writer complains to God about the trouble that other people are causing him. There's a bunch of the Psalms of Lament where David is being chased by Saul and his life's in danger because of all of these enemies. And David cries out to God and he says, save me from my enemies. You're trying to kill me unjustly. Do something. Help me out. And in many of those Psalms, David pleads with God that he would take the pain away, that he would end the violence, that he would save him, that he would remove the enemy to save him from the evil enemy who was trying to crush him and kill him unjustly. But Lady Jerusalem, who's speaking here, she has a problem. She's not just being beaten up by some enemy out there. She's being struck by God. It's God himself who's inflicting the pain. When your evil enemy oppresses you, you can turn to God in your distress and ask him for help and deliverance. When it's God who's oppressing you, when it's God who's striking you, to whom do you turn for help? Who can you appeal to when your suffering and your trouble comes directly from God? And to make things even more complicated, this woman knows, she admits, she confesses that there's a reason for her suffering. She's going through this because of her own sin and her own iniquity. That image at the beginning of verse 14 is so powerful. God hasn't just arbitrarily taken some heavy load and hung it around your neck to punish you. It's my transgression. He's taken my transgression in verse 14. He bound it into a yoke by his hand. They were fastened together and they were set upon my neck. God has taken my iniquity and my sin and my depravity and the things that I have done in my transgressions. He's bundled them all together in a big package. He's tied them together with his hands and then he's put it on my neck. Who do you complain to when your suffering not only comes from the hand of God, but when on top of that, the suffering with which he inflicts you is the weight and the penalty and the consequence of your own sin? And so there's nobody for Zion to appeal to in verse 17. Zion stretches out her hands. Help me. But there's none to comfort her. The Lord has commanded against Jacob that his neighbors should be his foes. Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. Now, the name Zion and Jerusalem refer to the same thing. Mount Zion was the large plateau, the large hill on which the city was built. On the main protuberance of the mount, there was the Temple Mount and the palace, and the whole city of Jerusalem was built around it. It's kind of like Mount Royal in Montreal, the way Montreal is built, and Montreal, Mount Royal, they sort of become synonymous. So Zion, let the character cut in just for that verse, and she picks up again, just in case you missed it. She not only wants to clearly admit her responsibility and her guilt in what has befallen her, but she actually vindicates the Lord for what he has done. Listen to verse 18. The Lord is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. The Lord is in the right, for I've rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and see my suffering. My young women and my young men have gone into captivity. I called to my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and elders perished in the city while they sought food to revive their strength. During the whole of the first 4 chapters, there will actually be very little that looks like prayer. We won't get into outright prayer and pleading with God until we get to chapter 5. But there are moments through the pain and the struggle of the first 4 chapters, there are these moments where this little piece of light gets through and we get an inkling of something that looks like the beginning of a prayer. I noted a moment ago, this is almost more of a complaint than a prayer. And we've had not only the admission of guilt, but also the admission that the Lord had been right to do this, to bring punishment upon her because it's merited consequence of her sin. So she's been complaining about what has befallen her. In verses 9 and 11, there was a moment where she pleaded with God to see how much pain she's in. And now in verse 20, she repeats that plea that the Lord will look at her distress, and she begins to formulate a prayer request for the first time. It's interesting. The first thing that the city was just in a prayer. Verse 20, look, O Lord, for I'm in distress. My stomach churns. My heart is wrung within me because I've been very rebellious. In the street the word bereaves, the sword bereaves, in the house it is like death. They heard my groaning, yet there's no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my trouble, and they're glad that you have done it. You have brought the day you announced. Now let them be as I am. Says, okay, God, I get it. I messed up. You're punishing me. You're using the Babylonians and my enemies to do this. But bring the same thing on them. Verse 22, let all their evil doing come before you and deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all my transgressions, for my groans are many and my heart is faint. Did you catch her request? She's not asking that the Lord would end her suffering. Interesting, isn't it? She's not saying, God, end my suffering. She says, I deserve this. I earned this. This is the consequence of my sin. So she doesn't say, God, stop the pain. She knows that these nations have become her enemies, that they've become the tools that God has used to fulfill her purposes. She doesn't question that. Her request is simply this, that these evildoers who have brought such suffering on her would also one day have to face the consequences of their own sin. I've sinned. I'm deserving of this punishment. Bring it on. But God, remember this when you deal with the Babylonians one day. Not a joyous, happy passage. Not a great positive text of Scripture. What do we do with this passage? Why is this heartbreaking passage, with all its complaining, even here in our Christian Bibles? It's here for three reasons. If we're honest with ourselves, rare are the moments when we turn to God in the midst of our trouble and affliction where we can claim that we are 100% in the right, entirely without blame and entirely without sin. I don't remember a single moment in my life where I've turned to God and cried in the midst of pain and anguish and distress, where I could say, I had nothing to do with this, I'm perfectly blameless, I did everything perfectly right, and this evil has befallen me completely, entirely out of no fault of my own. This text is here as an encouragement to cry out to God in the middle of our distress, even when we have caused it. Even in these moments when the world is crashing down around us and calamity has hit us and we are entirely to blame, even at those moments, the right response is always to cry out to God in our anguish. We sometimes think that when things are going wrong by my fault, that God could not possibly want to hear from me or have any sympathy for me. But nothing could be further from the truth. There is never a moment, no matter how guilty and broken you are, there is never a moment when God does not want to hear the cry from your aching, broken heart. But not only that, follow me closely here. If our God is there, if he sympathizes to our tears, if he hears our pleas and our cries when we have caused the calamity, when we have brought it in ourselves, if God is there at that moment listening, it's hard to imagine that he would not also be listening at those other moments when we face calamity through no fault of our own. Crying out to God in the middle of distress is always the right thing to do, no matter how great the calamity, no matter the cause of the trouble, no matter how responsible you are for the tragedy that's befallen you. Crying out to God is always the right thing to do. There's a second reason why this text is here. This text is here because there's a messianic prophecy in these verses. If you're a fan of Handel's Messiah like I am, you may have recognized a piece of this text in verses 11 and 12. When Jesus is on the cross just outside the city wall along the main road that leads to Jerusalem, the same road that's deserted in our text, but that was not deserted when Jesus hung there carrying the weight and the penalty of my sin. And they did the crucifixions in a very public place where everybody could see the shame of the person executed and condemned. At that moment, Handel puts these words in the mouth of Jesus at that moment of anguish and suffering. Look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which is brought upon me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. Now, there have indeed been moments in history when the fierce wrath and anger of the Lord have been unfurled. But none of those compare to that one moment in history when the holy, spotless, sinless Lamb of God took on himself the weight of my sin and transgression and carried them to the cross. And there, for the first time in his life, he feels the displeasure of God as he sits under my curse. And in verse 14, God takes my sin and yours, all of it, every misdeed, every stain, every misstep, every unrighteousness. And by his own hand, God fastens them together and places them as one large yoke upon his Son, and he surrenders his beloved Son to the hands of sinners who want his life. My transgressions were bound into a yoke, verse 14. By his hand they were fastened together. They were set upon my neck. He caused my strength to fail. The Lord gave me into the hands of those whom I cannot withstand. So this passage is also here because as we lift our voices to God and weep and plead for relief in the midst of the suffering and pain that our sin has caused, God points to the cross and unmistakably affirms that he has heard our pleas for mercy and for deliverance, and that he has provided for our redemption. Our redemption from the weight and consequence of our sin comes as it is placed on his Son at the cross. there's a third reason why this text is here. When the Babylonians fell on Jerusalem, it could have ended very, very differently. There are a number of other nations and people groups who were overtaken by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians and by other invading armies who were crushed into hopeless oblivion, completely wiped off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. There are dozens and hundreds of civilizations that the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Macedonians just wiped clear off the map and have never been seen since. As this little group of traumatized, shell-shocked people huddled together in the middle of what's left of their demolished city. You remember the Left Behind group? Remember them? They're there, they're destitute, they're poor, everything precious has been taken away. They look at the burnt-out rubble of the temple, the piles of stone that used to be an impenetrable defensive wall. As they look around them at this heartbreaking landscape, as they mourn those who have lost, as they cry for the children taken away and enslaved that they may never see again, taken to a foreign land. It's hard to imagine that there's still any future for them. It's hard to believe that God will still make something of this, and yet God's promises are there. His promises are there that out of this people, out of the lineage of King Zechariah, the descendant of David, will still come a great king who will lead the people to be a blessing to the nations of the world. As impossible as it may have seemed to this little group of refugees huddled together in the middle of what remained of their burnt-out city, there would be life again in these ruins. There would be a temple again, and God would visit them, would visit that temple, and through this restored city, he would bring hope and redemption. Because even in the midst of hopeless situations, there's always still a glimmer of light that God has his remnant. There's a small, it's shaken, it's insignificant in the eyes of the watching world, but the line of God's plan always traces its way through every calamity, through every trouble, surely, steadily, unmistakably winding its way to the end that God has designed. And so it is, ironically, that this chapter, as it describes the greatest calamity that the people of God have ever experienced, as it lays out the heartbreaking trauma of the fall of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple, the deportation to captivity, all the killing and the brutality, the children, all of this is recited in carefully metered, methodical poetry, following the Hebrew alphabet from letter to letter, from A to B to C to D to F, with meter and regularity, and it's coming, and it's coming. The good plan of our sovereign God is carried out and will come to fulfillment as he has promised and as he has planned. No matter the turmoil, no matter the upheaval, the sovereign God is there, and his plan is working out. In these days of trouble, facing uncertainties and worries like we never have before, in the midst of COVID and our isolation and our fears, now more than ever, we need to remember that God's sovereign plan works its straight line through the darkest of our days as his unfolding plan of redemption is working itself out. Amen.